The sun was high over Dallas, Texas, casting a golden glow on the sleek, modern facade of Patriot Motors, a luxury car dealership famous for its exclusive inventory and reputation for catering to the city's elite. Inside, the air hummed with an atmosphere of polished surfaces, muted conversations, and the faint aroma of leather and fresh coffee. It was the kind of place where deals were made with a handshake over sparkling wine and customers left with keys to cars worth more than most homes. Through the glass doors walked an elderly man, Joseph Joe Anderson. His entrance was unremarkable, marked only by the quiet clicking of his well-worn shoes against the tiled floor. Joe wore a simple outfit: khakis, a plaid button-up shirt, and a bright red MAGA hat perched atop his silver hair. Despite the simplicity of his appearance, there was a certain steadiness to his gait, a confidence that only decades of hard-earned wisdom could instill. He wasn't here to make a scene. He was here for a purpose. Joe had come to Patriot Motors with one thing in mind: to buy his grandson the car of his dreams as a gift for his college graduation. Joe's grandson, Derek, had worked tirelessly to graduate with honors, and Joe felt it was only right to reward his diligence with something that would symbolize success and perseverance: a luxury sedan that Derek had once pointed out with excitement in a glossy magazine. As Joe stepped into the brightly lit showroom, his presence barely registered with the staff. Behind the main desk, a young receptionist glanced at him briefly before returning to her computer, the flicker of disinterest evident in her expression. Across the room, two salesmen leaned against a counter, their eyes scanning the well-dressed clientele who wandered among the gleaming vehicles on display. They didn't bother to look in Joe's direction. Joe paused for a moment, taking in the grandeur of the space. The polished marble floors reflected the pristine paint jobs of luxury cars, sleek sports cars and powerful SUVs, all lined up like trophies on display. To Joe, they weren't just cars. They were a testament to craftsmanship and innovation. With a faint smile, he adjusted his hat and approached the receptionist's desk. "Good afternoon," Joe began, his voice steady but warm. "I'd like to take a look at your luxury sedans. Specifically, I'm interested in the Patriot Elite S-Class." The receptionist barely glanced up from her screen. "The S-Class? That's our most expensive model," she said curtly, her tone dismissive. She didn't ask for his name or offer a greeting. Instead, she gestured vaguely toward the far end of the showroom. "You can take a look over there." Joe nodded, undeterred. "Thank you," he replied, his politeness unwavering. He made his way toward the section of the showroom she had pointed to, where a silver Patriot Elite sat under the spotlight, its chrome accents gleaming. Joe ran his hand lightly along the car's smooth exterior, appreciating the craftsmanship. As he admired the car, he overheard murmurs from the salesman nearby. "Hey, check out the guy with the hat," one of them whispered, loud enough for Joe to hear. "Think he wandered into the wrong place?" The other chuckled. "Yeah, probably looking for a used pickup lot. Doesn't look like he can even afford the rims on this thing." Joe turned slightly, his sharp ears catching every word, though he pretended not to notice. He had heard comments like this before. It wasn't the first time someone had judged him by his appearance, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. He let the words roll off him, his focus remaining on the car. Moments later, one of the salesmen, a tall man in his mid-30s named Brad, approached Joe. His smile was forced, more a display of obligation than genuine interest. "Hello, sir," Brad began, his tone carrying an edge of condescension. "Can I help you with something? This section is reserved for our high-end models." Joe looked up at him with calm eyes. "Yes, I'd like to know more about the Elite S-Class. It's for my grandson's graduation. I'm interested in purchasing one today." Brad blinked, momentarily caught off guard, but quickly recovered. His smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, that's a fine car," he said, his tone now laced with skepticism. "But I should warn you, it's one of our most expensive models. We usually deal with serious buyers for these." Are you sure it's within your budget? Joe's expression didn't falter. I'm sure, he replied simply. Brad hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. He glanced at Joe's hat again, as if it were a neon sign screaming, "Not our usual clientele." Finally, he said, "Tell you what, why don't I show you something a little more practical? We've got a great selection of pre-owned models over in the other lot." Joe's lips pressed into a thin line. He took a moment to steady himself before replying, his tone calm but firm. "I'm not interested in pre-owned models. I came here for the Elite S-Class. If you're unwilling to help me, perhaps someone else can." Before Brad could respond, the dealership's manager, Ryan Collins, strode over, having overheard the exchange. Ryan was the epitome of corporate arrogance, slicked back hair, a tailored suit, and an air of superiority that followed him like a shadow. He eyed Joe with thinly veiled disdain, his gaze lingering on the red hat. "Is there a problem here?" Ryan asked, his voice dripping with mock politeness. Joe met his gaze evenly. "No problem at all. I was just asking about purchasing the Elite S-Class, but it seems your team is more interested in showing me something else." Ryan smirked, clearly amused. "The S-Class is our flagship model," he said, his tone condescending. "It's not something we typically sell without prior arrangements. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable looking at our entry-level options." The insinuation hung in the air, heavy with disrespect. A few customers nearby turned their heads, sensing the tension. Joe's grip tightened slightly on the edge of his cane, but he remained composed. "I appreciate your input," he said quietly, "but I know exactly what I'm looking for." Ryan chuckled, crossing his arms. "Do you?" he asked, his sarcasm thinly veiled. "Because, to be honest, sir, we cater to a specific clientele here. If you're not prepared to meet that standard, I'd hate to waste your time." Joe held Ryan's gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a small nod, he turned and walked toward the exit. The room seemed to exhale as he left, the staff exchanging smug glances. Little did they know, the man they had just dismissed so easily was far from ordinary, and their actions would soon set into motion a chain of events that none of them could have anticipated. The sleek glass doors of Patriot Motors swung shut behind Joe Anderson as he stepped outside, his cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement. For a moment, he paused at the curb, taking in the sight of the dealership. The reflection of the luxury cars glinted in the sun, a picture of success and exclusivity. Joe's expression remained calm, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. He reached for his phone, a sleek device far more modern than one might expect for a man his age. His fingers moved with precision as he pulled up his contacts and made a call. "It's me," Joe said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of authority. "I need some information on Patriot Motors. Ownership, financials, everything. Get it to me in the next hour." He paused, listening to the response on the other end, then added, "No, don't ask why. Just do it." Joe ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. His gaze lingered on the dealership for a moment longer before he walked to his car, a sleek black vehicle that, while understated, exuded quiet luxury. As he slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. The staff at Patriot Motors had made their assumptions, and now they would learn the cost of underestimating him. Inside the dealership, the atmosphere had returned to its usual hum of activity. Ryan Collins, the manager, leaned against the sales desk, recounting his interaction with Joe to Brad and a few other salespeople. His tone was laced with mockery. "Did you see the hat?" Ryan sneered, shaking his head. "Guy walks in here like he's about to buy the whole place. Please. He probably doesn't even know the first thing about these cars." Brad chuckled, clearly enjoying the show. "Yeah, I was waiting for him to start haggling over floor mats." Classic. The other salespeople joined in, their laughter filling the air. None of them noticed the receptionist shifting uncomfortably at her desk, her expression uncertain. Unlike the others, she had caught the calm determination in Joe's eyes, and it unsettled her. But she kept her thoughts to herself, focusing instead on her screen. As the staff continued to exchange jabs, a commotion at the front desk caught their attention. A well-dressed man in his 40s had entered the showroom, his tailored suit and polished demeanor immediately commanding respect. He carried an air of importance, the kind that made people instinctively stand a little straighter. "Good afternoon," the man said crisply, addressing the receptionist. "I'm looking for Ryan Collins." Ryan stepped forward, his confidence on full display. "That's me," he said, extending a hand. "How can I help you?" The man shook his hand briefly, his expression professional but serious. "My name is Marcus Sterling. I represent Mr. Anderson." Ryan's brow furrowed in confusion. "Anderson? The guy who was just here?" Marcus gave a curt nod. "That's correct. Mr. Anderson has a vested interest in your dealership, and he's asked me to deliver a message." Ryan raised an eyebrow, the smirk returning to his face. "A vested interest? Let me guess. He wants a discount on the Elite S-Class?" Marcus's expression didn't waver. "Not quite. Mr. Anderson has just acquired a controlling interest in Patriot Motors." For a moment, the showroom fell silent. The words hung in the air, almost too surreal to process. Ryan blinked, the smirk faltering as he tried to comprehend what he had just heard. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone sharp. "That's impossible." Marcus reached into his briefcase and produced a folder, handing it to Ryan. "You'll find the details here. The deal was finalized moments ago. Mr. Anderson now owns 60% of Patriot Motors' parent company, which makes him your majority shareholder." The sales staff exchanged stunned glances, their earlier laughter replaced by uneasy silence. Ryan flipped through the documents, his hands trembling slightly as he scanned the pages. The information was all there, legal, binding, and undeniable. "This has to be some kind of mistake," Ryan stammered. "How could he? He was just here." Marcus smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Mr. Anderson moves quickly when necessary. He didn't appreciate the way he was treated during his visit, and he decided to address the matter personally." Ryan's face turned red, a mix of embarrassment and anger boiling to the surface. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You expect me to believe some guy in a cheap hat waltzed in here and bought the company out of spite?" Marcus's gaze hardened. "Mr. Anderson doesn't act out of spite. He acts with purpose. And as of now, his purpose is ensuring this dealership operates with the respect and professionalism it claims to represent." The weight of the words settled over the room, the implications clear. Ryan opened his mouth to protest again, but Marcus cut him off. "I suggest you take this opportunity to reflect on your actions, Mr. Collins. Mr. Anderson will be arriving shortly to address the staff. I recommend you prepare yourself." Without another word, Marcus turned and walked away, leaving Ryan and the rest of the team in stunned silence. Outside, Joe Anderson parked his car near the dealership's entrance, taking a moment to adjust his hat before stepping out. He moved with the same quiet confidence as before, his demeanor unchanged despite the seismic shift in circumstances. As he approached the glass doors, customers and staff alike turned to watch, their curiosity piqued by the sudden tension in the air. Joe entered the showroom, his eyes scanning the room with a calm yet piercing gaze. Ryan stepped forward, his earlier bravado replaced by nervousness. "Mr. Anderson," he began, forcing a smile, "I wasn't expecting you back so soon." Joe met his gaze evenly. "I wasn't expecting to be treated like I didn't belong here," he replied, his tone steady but firm. "But I suppose life has a way of surprising us." Ryan's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Joe took a step closer, his presence filling the room. "I've spent my life building something out of nothing," he continued. "I know what it means to work hard, to earn respect, and to treat people with dignity. What I experienced here today was none of those things. The staff shifted uncomfortably, their earlier smugness replaced by growing unease. Joe's voice remained calm, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. This dealership represents more than just luxury cars. It represents an ideal, a promise to treat every customer with the respect they deserve, no matter who they are or what they wear. That promise was broken today. He paused, letting his words sink in. But as the new owner of Patriot Motors, I intend to make things right. The weight of his statement hit like a thunderclap, and the room fell silent. The stage was set for a reckoning none of them could have anticipated. The silence in the dealership was deafening as Joe Anderson's words echoed through the air. The staff stood frozen, their earlier arrogance now replaced by an unmistakable tension. Ryan Collins, the manager, struggled to keep his composure, his face a mix of confusion and panic. The weight of Joe's statement was sinking in, and he realized he was standing on shaky ground. Joe took a slow step forward, his cane tapping softly against the pristine tile floor. His gaze swept over the showroom, his eyes briefly locking with each member of the staff. Though he spoke calmly, his words carried the weight of undeniable authority. "This dealership is a symbol of excellence," Joe began, his voice steady but firm. "It prides itself on selling luxury and class. Yet the way I was treated today shows a complete lack of both. It wasn't just unprofessional, it was disrespectful, and I don't tolerate disrespect." Ryan swallowed hard, his usual smugness nowhere to be found. "Mr. Anderson," he stammered, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. We had no idea who you were." Joe raised a brow, his expression calm yet razor-sharp. "And that's the problem, isn't it, Mr. Collins? You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with decency. Every person who walks through these doors should be treated with the same respect, whether they're wearing a suit, jeans, or a red hat." The receptionist shifted uneasily at her desk, clearly recalling her own observations from earlier. Meanwhile, some of the salespeople exchanged guilty glances, the weight of their earlier behavior now sinking in. Ryan tried to regain control of the situation, forcing a tight smile. "We didn't mean any offense, Mr. Anderson. It was a busy day and maybe there was some miscommunication. We'll, do better moving forward." Joe's gaze didn't waver. "Miscommunication? Let me remind you of exactly what happened, Mr. Collins. I walked in here prepared to make a purchase, one that would have benefited this dealership significantly. And instead of being greeted with professionalism, I was dismissed and ridiculed. You assumed, based on nothing but appearances, that I didn't belong here." Ryan's face turned red, but he didn't dare interrupt. Joe's words were hitting harder with every syllable. "What you and your staff failed to understand," Joe continued, "is that success doesn't always wear the uniform you expect. Sometimes it looks like a retired man in a hat, walking in with nothing but his determination and his values. Values you all seem to have forgotten." The weight of his statement lingered in the air, and for a moment, no one dared to speak. Finally, Joe turned to Marcus Sterling, who had been quietly observing the scene. "Marcus," Joe said, his tone sharp, "begin the evaluations." Marcus nodded and stepped forward, pulling out a sleek tablet. "Effective immediately," Marcus announced, "this dealership will undergo a comprehensive review. Every employee's conduct, performance, and customer interactions will be assessed." Ryan's eyes widened in alarm. "Wait, what?" he blurted. "You're evaluating us?" Joe's calm expression didn't falter. "That's correct. A business is only as strong as its people, and today, I've seen exactly where the weaknesses lie. Those who uphold the values of respect, professionalism, and integrity will stay. Those who don't—" He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Won't." The sales team exchanged panicked glances. Brad, the loudest of the group earlier, now looked pale and uneasy. "This isn't fair," he muttered under his breath. "We didn't know he was—" Joe cut him off with a sharp look. "You didn't know. And yet you chose to assume. That's the real issue, isn't it? Brad fell silent, his gaze dropping to the floor. Marcus began calling staff members aside one by one, each summoned for a private conversation in Joe's newly assigned office. The receptionist was the first to go, her nervous energy evident as she followed Marcus down the hall. The remaining employees stood in uneasy clusters, their whispers low and frantic. Ryan, meanwhile, tried to salvage what was left of his authority. He approached Joe, his tone now bordering on desperation. "Mr. Anderson, I want to assure you that this dealership has always operated at the highest standard. Today was an unfortunate exception, but it doesn't reflect—" Joe held up a hand, silencing him. "Mr. Collins, I appreciate your attempt to spin the situation, but actions speak louder than words. The truth of this dealership's culture has been on full display today, and it's clear that change is necessary. Whether or not you'll be part of that change remains to be seen." Ryan's face turned a deeper shade of red. "I've managed this dealership for 5 years," he said, his voice tight. "Our sales numbers speak for themselves. Surely that counts for something." Joe's expression remained unreadable. "Sales are important, Mr. Collins, but they're not everything. A true leader understands that respect and integrity are just as crucial. Let's see if your record reflects that understanding." With that, Joe turned and walked toward the lounge area, leaving Ryan standing frozen in place. Meanwhile, the private evaluations continued. The receptionist, nervous but honest, admitted that she had noticed the unprofessional behavior of her colleagues, but felt powerless to intervene. Joe appreciated her candor, and Marcus took careful notes. Next came Brad, whose earlier bravado had all but disappeared. He stammered through vague justifications, attempting to downplay his role in the incident. Marcus remained unimpressed, his expression cool as he took note of every excuse. As the evaluations progressed, a pattern emerged. Those who had treated Joe poorly were now scrambling to explain themselves, while the few employees who had shown professionalism and respect stood out like beacons of hope in an otherwise toxic culture. By the time Marcus finished, it was clear that changes were not only warranted, but overdue. Joe reconvened the staff in the showroom, his presence commanding their full attention. "Today has been eye-opening," Joe began, his tone resolute. "I've seen the best and worst of this dealership's staff, and I'm ready to make some decisions. This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about ensuring that every customer who walks through these doors is treated with the dignity they deserve." He glanced at Marcus, who handed him a list. Joe's eyes scanned it briefly before he spoke again. "Effective immediately, there will be changes to the team. Some of you have demonstrated the professionalism and respect this dealership needs. Others—" he paused, his gaze landing on Ryan and Brad— "have not." The room tensed as Joe's decisions began to take shape. The reckoning had arrived, and no one would walk away unchanged. Joe Anderson's sharp gaze swept across the group of employees. The air was thick with tension, each person silently wondering where they stood in this rapidly shifting hierarchy. Ryan Collins, once so sure of his dominance, now fidgeted nervously, his hands clenched behind his back. Brad stood to the side, arms crossed, his bravado replaced by a simmering anxiety. Joe cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the silence. "This dealership is more than a place to sell cars. It's a reflection of a brand, of values. Respect, professionalism, and integrity are the cornerstones of that brand. When those values are ignored, it doesn't just hurt the business, it destroys trust." He turned to Marcus, who handed him the finalized evaluation report. "After a thorough review of today's incident, it's clear that some members of this team have fallen short. Effective immediately, there will be terminations." A collective gasp rippled through the group, followed by a tense silence. Joe's voice was steady, deliberate, as he began to name names. "Brad Wilson," Joe said, his tone cool. Brad's face paled, and he stammered a weak protest, but Joe raised a hand to silence him. Your behavior today was not only unprofessional, but openly disrespectful. Dismissing a potential customer, any customer, because of your assumptions is unacceptable. Pack your things. You're done here." Brad's mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came out. He slumped his shoulders and stormed off toward his desk, muttering under his breath. Joe's gaze shifted to Ryan Collins. "Mr. Collins, as the manager of this dealership, the culture here starts with you. Today's incident was not an isolated event. It was a reflection of the environment you fostered. You allowed arrogance and bias to take precedence over professionalism. Effective immediately, your position as manager is terminated." Ryan's face turned beet red. "Mr. Anderson, with all due respect, I've been running this dealership for years. One mistake doesn't define—" "This wasn't one mistake," Joe interrupted, his voice firm. "It's a pattern that stops today." Ryan stood frozen for a moment, his pride warring with his fear. Finally, he nodded stiffly, turned, and walked away without another word. The rest of the staff stood in stunned silence, unsure of what to expect next. Joe took a deep breath and softened his tone slightly. "For those of you who demonstrated professionalism and respect today, you have nothing to worry about. This is your chance to be part of a dealership that values not just sales, but the people who make those sales possible." He turned to Marcus. "We'll be bringing in new leadership and implementing a comprehensive training program to ensure that every member of this team understands the values we expect." Marcus nodded. "Already in motion, Mr. Anderson. I'll begin scheduling the sessions immediately." As the dust began to settle, Joe took a moment to walk the floor of the dealership. The tension had eased somewhat, replaced by an undercurrent of cautious optimism. A few employees approached him, expressing their gratitude for his fairness and commitment to change. Joe nodded warmly, offering reassurance and a sense of stability. In the corner of the showroom, Joe noticed a young salesperson, Claire, who had been one of the few to treat him with respect earlier in the day. She was organizing a stack of brochures, her posture tense but determined. "Claire," Joe called, his voice gentle. She looked up, her eyes widening slightly. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course, Mr. Anderson," she said, setting the brochures aside and walking over. "I wanted to thank you," Joe began. "Your professionalism and courtesy didn't go unnoticed. In a difficult situation, you showed the kind of character this dealership needs more of." Claire's cheeks flushed. "Thank you, sir. I just try to treat everyone the way I'd want to be treated." Joe smiled. "That's exactly the attitude we need here. I have a feeling you'll be an important part of this dealership's future." Claire blinked in surprise. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." As she returned to her work, Joe felt a glimmer of hope. Despite the challenges of the day, there were still good people here, people worth investing in. Meanwhile, Ryan and Brad were packing up their belongings in the back office. The tension between them was palpable, each blaming the other for their downfall. "This is ridiculous," Brad muttered, "all over a stupid hat." Ryan glared at him. "This happened because you couldn't keep your mouth shut. You're the one who made the scene." "Oh, please," Brad shot back. "You're the manager. You let it happen." Their argument fizzled out as they realized the futility of blaming each other. Both knew the real issue wasn't the hat. It was their own arrogance and lack of professionalism. But it was too late to fix their mistakes now. As the afternoon wore on, Joe called the remaining staff together for a final meeting. Standing at the center of the showroom, he addressed them with a mix of authority and encouragement. "Today marks a turning point for this dealership," Joe said. "It's not just about selling cars. It's about creating a culture of respect and excellence. That starts now, with each of you. Together, we can rebuild this dealership into something we can all be proud of." The staff nodded, their expressions a mix of relief and determination. For the first time all day, the atmosphere felt lighter, infused with a sense of possibility. As the meeting concluded, Joe turned to Marcus. "Let's get to work," he said. "We have a lot to do." Marcus grinned. Yes, we do, but I have no doubt we'll turn this place around. With that, Joe Anderson took a deep breath, feeling a sense of satisfaction. He had come into the dealership expecting to buy a car and ended up buying the entire business. It wasn't the day he had planned, but it was the kind of challenge he thrived on. Now, it was time to prove that respect and integrity weren't just words. They were the foundation of success. Joe Anderson stood in the dealership's showroom as the late afternoon sunlight streamed through the glass windows, illuminating the cars that gleamed like polished trophies. The space felt different now. The air of arrogance and exclusion that had permeated it earlier in the day had been replaced by an undercurrent of hope. But Joe knew this was just the beginning. As the remaining staff filtered back to their stations, Marcus approached him, clipboard in hand. I've drafted an outline for the immediate changes we need to implement, Joe, he said, his tone both professional and optimistic. Leadership restructuring, customer service training, and a revised code of conduct are at the top of the list. Joe nodded, scanning the clipboard. Good work, Marcus. But let's make one thing clear to the team. These changes aren't just about damage control. This is about setting a standard, one that we'll uphold moving forward. Marcus smiled. Understood. I'll make sure everyone knows we're building something bigger than just a dealership. Joe handed the clipboard back and looked around the room. His gaze fell on a young mechanic named Javier, who had kept his head down during the earlier drama, but had stepped up to assist Claire in calming a frustrated customer. Joe called him over. Javier, Joe began, extending a hand. I noticed how you handled yourself today. You could have stayed in the garage and ignored what was happening, but you didn't. You stepped in to help, and that says a lot about your character. Javier shook his hand, clearly surprised. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. I just figured the customer deserved better, you know. Joe smiled. Exactly. That kind of initiative is what we need here. Keep it up. As the day drew to a close, Joe gathered the remaining staff for one final meeting. They stood in a loose circle around him, some still processing the events of the day, others eager to move forward. Today was a wake-up call, Joe began, his voice steady and authoritative. What happened here earlier, the disrespect, the lack of professionalism, that's not who we're going to be anymore. This dealership represents more than just cars. It represents trust, community, and opportunity. He paused, letting his words sink in. The staff listened intently, sensing the gravity of the moment. I know some of you are wondering what comes next, Joe continued. Let me tell you, we're going to rebuild this dealership from the ground up. That means new leadership, new values, and a renewed commitment to our customers and each other. Claire raised her hand hesitantly. Mr. Anderson, does that mean we're all starting over? I mean, is there still a place for us here? Joe's expression softened. For those of you who are willing to embrace the changes we're making, absolutely. I'm not here to clean house for the sake of it. I'm here to build a team that believes in what we're doing. Claire nodded, relief washing over her face. Several other employees exchanged glances, their shoulders relaxing slightly. Joe turned to Marcus. Tomorrow, I want a meeting with the entire staff to lay out our vision and expectations, and make sure everyone knows they'll have a chance to ask questions and voice concerns. We're not just imposing changes, we're building a culture together. Marcus nodded. Consider it done. Later that evening, Joe walked through the dealership one last time, the space quiet and still. He paused in front of the desk where Ryan Collins had sat earlier, the memory of the man's arrogance fresh in his mind. Joe didn't take any pleasure in what had happened, but he knew it was necessary. Sometimes, leadership required making tough decisions for the good of the whole. He moved on to the garage, where Javier was finishing up a last-minute repair. The young mechanic looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. Still here? Joe asked, his tone lighter now. Javier shrugged. Figured I'd finish this up. It didn't feel right leaving it for tomorrow. Joe smiled. That's the kind of dedication we need around here. Keep it up, and you'll go far. As Joe turned to leave, Javier called after him. "Mr. Anderson, can I ask you something?" "Of course," Joe said, turning back. "Why did you buy this place? I mean, after the way they treated you, most people would have just walked away." Joe considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because it's not about what happened to me. It's about what this dealership can become. People deserve better than what they got here today. Customers, employees, everyone. If I walked away, nothing would change. But if I stayed, I could make a difference." Javier nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. Thanks, Mr. Anderson." "Call me Joe," he said with a grin, "and get some rest. Tomorrow's a big day." The following morning, the dealership reopened with a renewed sense of purpose. Joe and Marcus stood side by side as the staff arrived, greeting each person with a handshake and a smile. The tension that had lingered the previous day was replaced by cautious optimism, a feeling that things were finally heading in the right direction. Joe called the team together for the first official meeting of the new era. Standing in front of the group, he spoke with conviction. "This dealership isn't just under new ownership," he said. "It's under new leadership. And that leadership isn't just me, it's all of us. Together, we're going to create something we can be proud of." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time, Joe felt that they were truly united. He knew there would be challenges ahead, but he also knew they were ready to face them together. As Joe walked out onto the showroom floor, watching the first customers of the day walk through the doors, he felt a sense of fulfillment. He had come to the dealership expecting to buy a car. Instead, he had bought a business, and with it, the chance to make a real impact. Joe Anderson wasn't just a customer anymore. He was a leader. And this was just the beginning.